My name's Jason Hall and this is my G321 Foundation portfolio. In this production I was given a variety of different tasks to create a final production of a local bulletin. The first task I was given was a media image analysis. In this I looked at the different demographics of birthday cards and I looked over teenage ones as I thought it was more relevant to my age. I then performed a personal task of me and media where I looked at social media and video gaming, and I talked about communication and the different activities and functionalities I could perform on this. I then did a preliminary task in a group which consisted of a 30 to 40 second broadcast for a particular target audience. In the blog I talk about the different tasks I did to create this bulletin. So I looked at who the interviewee would be, the codes and conventions, the script, the flowchart, and the editing process I had to perform to create a perfect copy of our bulletin. The video here demonstrates me and my group debating over what the show would be about and who the target audience would be, and there's the final production. Then I had to answer the question, what kind of media institution would distribute your media product and why? In this, I talked about the different radio institutions such as Celadon Global Radio. I talked about how they get distributed to our homes and why Global Radio would be a better institution for our bulletin as it is more popular. I then had to look into the genre of news. So I looked at the different news elements such as timelines, proximities, bad news, etc. and briefly summarize them and say what made them news elements. I then had to talk about what makes good news. So I talked about all the facts, faces and voices, so the witnesses. I then looked at an example of a local bulletin at the BBC institution where I had to choose from a variety of different areas, but the area I decided to choose from was York, as it is a very rural area and would focus on a lot of radio. I then looked at the codes and conventions of BBC York, such as the jingle, radio, identification, continuity, announcer, etc. I then looked at commercial radio, which I chose Capital Manchester, as this is a very urban area, and I wanted to contrast rural and urban areas. I looked at the different codes and conventions of this and compared it to the BBC one to see the differences between commercial radio and BBC radio. So the intro, I present identification, vox box, etc. I then looked at the content analysis where I analysed the headlines, content and news values. I then compared the BBC and commercial radio institutions, which were the background, the vox box and the duration. I then was tasked into looking into audience research where I talked about mass, niche audiences and the different demographics. I looked at Rajar, which measures the percentages of people who watch radio in different areas. And I compared BBC York to Capital Manchester and found out that York, as a rural area, has a higher percentage in listeners for radio. I then was put in a group to perform primary research and interview a variety of different people. I asked 4 questions: how well do you know your area? What do you like about your area? What would you improve on your area? And what news would you like to hear? One specific example was a middle-aged woman of working class who said she didn't like her area, but would like to hear about crimes, transport and incidents. I then looked at Stuart Hall's encoding and decoding model and talked about how a sender encodes a message due to their own framework of knowledge to a decoder who uses their knowledge to analyse something. I then looked at the 3 readings of dominant, negotiative and oppositional readings, the hypodermic needle explanation, the dominant ideology, the active and passive audience, the effect in cultivation theory. Finally, I was tasked into looking what local means in a local bulletin. In media, it connects to a niche audience as local differentiates depending on the person's area. So this can consist of local weather, local sport, etc. To further my understanding, I looked at a book called What Do We Mean by Media that says that in 1973 to the 1990s, there was a better understanding of the word local as they spoke the same and they spoke of relevant topics. In this, it talked about how in present time, local has become more irrelevant and has more gone to more global and nationwide news. So it's very hard to answer the question, what is a local bulletin? And that is my G321 foundation portfolio, and my candidate number is 6059.